This is silly, and I don't even know why, but you did say hear it, so I'm going to do something I never do. I'm going to narrate it for you. Hopefully, this isn't too long or too annoying. My airplane landed outside of Washington, D.C. on my return flight from my first deployment to Bahrain. It was 2014. There were some delays, so a layover overnight. But of course, there were. We had our deployment extended by a month, and while it wasn't terribly onerous, it was, unfortunately, terribly typical. Since I was going to fly to San Diego and then to DFW to Dallas Fort Worth to visit family on leave, I was able to get the airport to just swap me to a flight to DFW, though it was also not until the next day. But, ever the eternal optimist, I decided to do what I always have been told one does if ever in Washington, D.C. I called my congressman, who was out of the office for several days, likely back home doing at-home things. But when I asked the staff if they knew of any tour things and explained my situation, they were only too happy to ask me to come by as they can lead tour groups. This was not my first time in Washington, D.C., nor would it be my last. It was the only one where I actually had time to do anything and was probably the most pleasant in its way. The first was going to be interviewed by the leadership in charge of the U.S. Navy's nuclear power program. A daunting thing for a person with no history with the military to be sitting across the table from a four-star admiral asking you why you wanted in his Navy and why he should accept you. And my later trip was even more onerous, going to take the post-tour nuclear power examination, which one would take if they intended to stay in the Navy or if they didn't. I should note that by the time I went, I had decided I did not, but I did my best anyway. As it turns out, I'm terrible at exactly reproducing large quantities of text exactly from memory, but as ever in life, I have a full and robust understanding of things I encounter and master. Needless to say, the former was what mattered to them, but fortunately for me, it was ultimately irrelevant. This visit was in 2014, and was all before the relatively recent memory events in D.C., so things were more open and friendly then. The young staffers of my congressman gave myself and 5 others a tour of the Capitol. Through the underground tunnels from the congressional offices, talking about the history of the buildings, the pictures, the statues from each state, which I think were later removed because of that vile anti-monument movement. I do feel strongly about such things, my apologies. To the congressional chambers themselves, pointing out the spots where you could hear acoustics from the other side of the room and why they moved desks to prevent remote eavesdropping. Yeah, there were a few spots in the rooms where the acoustics were just right, and you could hear the faintest whispers from other nodes in the room. Needless to say, when the politicians of the 1800s discovered this, they realized no one wanted to sit at a desk at these nodes and had to shift things around a bit. The young staffer leading the tour was nearly fawning over me, an active duty sailor returning home fresh from a deployment overseas. It was the closest thing in my life I've ever experienced to hero worship, and was just as awkward as my introverted self would have imagined it to be. But I was put in mind of a quote, from a video game of all things, but it is a good quote, from the intro to Halo 2. Folks need heroes, Chief, to give 'em hope. So smile, will ya, while we've still got something to smile about. I've long recognized the power of icons, and how they can give people hope and lighten their burdens. So if my nation calls on me to smile and nod politely to give some kid hope for the future, then that I would do. The tour itself was fascinating and informative, but too brief. When it ended, I still had quite a bit of sunlight left. So, taking some pamphlets in hand from back at the congressman's office of things to see, I left the congressional office we got back to and headed down to the National Mall, with the Washington Monument standing proudly atop the hill at its east end. For those who have seen it in movies, it always looks so wonderful. The large reflecting pool, the Washington Monument, and Lincoln Memorial standing proudly at their far ends. The water's always so clear, and there are people all over in movies. It's where you see the massive crowds gathered when new presidents are sworn in, or in scenes in movies where grand awards are given or statements made to rally the nation. That famous scene from Captain America movie where he's running laps around it saying, "On your left," as he passes by his friend over and over. The scene from Forrest Gump where he's receiving the award from President Kennedy. And video from massive crowds when presidents take their oaths of office. When I was there, it was undergoing construction, so fencing everywhere and the water had been drained. As you can imagine, it was somewhat less majestic. But I still knew what it was supposed to be. I walked to the World War II Veterans Memorial. It was open to the sky, probably had no maintenance costs, and I remember a few months earlier when the government shutdown occurred under the Obama administration, In an effort to inflict pain on the American people for political advantage, I can think of no reason why they do it, his administration attempted to shut down this memorial, among many others. This one, an open plaza with no upkeep or manning, had been closed behind some flimsy metal barricades. Some World War II veterans had gone there on a tour of the nation's capital with the intent to visit this memorial, and they, being, World War II veterans, crashed through the barricades of their memorial anyway. I suppose the administration realized how negative the optics would look of arresting World War II veterans visiting their own memorial, and so left them to it. Still, the memorial itself was sobering to visit in an apolitical sense, as all such things are. Lists of names always are. Passing the reflection pool and entering the green, I was initially struck by how different this was than Bahrain. Bahrain was, well, brown. Sand, somewhat like Laredo, Texas, where I grew up, but somehow even more so, and far less diverse. You mostly saw young to middle-aged men, nearly all Arabic, and occasionally boys out playing soccer on some of the side streets. But here, the grass and trees were green. I remember the green. It was spring, I believe. Pleasant weather, light clouds, sunny skies, warming temperatures. And the people. I remember seeing a young couple with their children, an older Asian man and woman holding hands in silent contemplation, a lesbian couple, a large tour group of young adults and teenagers, black, brown, white, people from all skin colors, ages, religions, walks of life. This was America, a verdant land with all types of people living together hand in hand. I walked by a red, I think it was, building there, though I didn't go in. I can't recall if it was due to it closing soon or it already closed. What struck me was the building was much smaller, at least from the outside, than I would have thought for so storied an institution. I walked to the end and up the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. A bit of foreshadowing, if I think about it, because the aircraft carrier I would end up on someday was the USS Abraham Lincoln. 3 to 4 times life-size President Lincoln sat on a massive stone chair that would make any ancient king jealous for such a throne, with quotes etched into the stone that will pass the ages. Makes me think about today, the things that have survived the eons from their time to ours, and what we know of the most ancient civilizations like Sumer. Are those words carved into tablets of clay and stone? That which is etched into stone is what survives the ages, not microchips, and often not pages or scrolls of parchment. And they were good quotes. Then I walked across a bridge. A long bridge. I realized where this bridge went. Across the river Potomac into Virginia. To Arlington, Virginia. Now understand, I'm a very logical, rational, I think and hope, well put together person most of the time. I often describe my emotions as the glassy surface of a smooth pond, which is what it would appear too much of the world as. And as I prefer it, by the way. But I understand the currents that run deep below that pool that rarely or never skirt the surface. I understand what I control on top and what I do not that lies beneath. The cacophony of introspection and raw base emotion intermingled. Suffice to say, the one place I felt on earth I should not be walking alone by myself, being emotionally and physically drained from a deployment, was Arlington National Cemetery, the sacred resting place of the honored fallen of conflicts and generations past. And so it was I found myself stepping onto the main road, entering Arlington National Cemetery, the sacred resting place of the honored fallen of conflicts and generations past. For those who have never been, it's difficult to describe, especially for a person in the mental and emotional state I was in at the time, and I suspect for any veteran, especially for those who know someone resting there. It's quiet. Quiet. That was the first thing I noted. It's technically an army base, for those who didn't know, and there are signs, of course, that say out of respect to be quiet. But I don't just mean the people. Despite it being open to the sky, and there were birds and surely insects, none made a sound as I passed. The bird songs were silent, the insects still. As if nature itself understood how sacred a place it was sharing with the resting warriors of humanity's past, and how even it did not wish to disturb their slumber. It's hard not to mention, but impossible to describe the enormity of the impact it can have on a person. So many markers, such all-encompassing silence. So many streets. And as I walked them, the only sounds that came to my ears were my near-silent footfalls. I remember thinking, introspective as I was, that I was here now, and so the last place I should go alone, and in this state, was the tomb of the unknown soldier. And so it was I found myself stepping up to the plaza at the tomb of the unknown soldier just before the changing of the guard at sunset. At sunset, my first evening back in my home country, I witnessed quite possibly the single most solemn duty that any soldier can ever have, that any American can ever witness. My apologies. The tomb of the unknown soldier represents more than just one person. It represents, like the POW, prisoner of war, MIA, missing in action table, on every United States Navy ship and in every United States Navy mess hall on base. All those whose remains we have not identified or have not recovered. Those who gave all for the rest of us, both found and still waiting to be found. For we will never truly leave anyone behind. Even now, decades later, the U.S. still receives remains from France, from D-Day, every year to bring them home and put them to proper rest. This is the most sacred duty a nation can owe its people. The most sacred duty that a human can have. The responsibility owed. The debt for an impossible service already paid. With the Pentagon visible in the far distance, the spires of the monuments across the river in D.C., and the sun setting in the west, I stood in silence with those others gathered here, and watched as the oncoming soldier and his weapons were inspected by the soldier standing the watch, both dressed to absolute perfection in their dress uniforms, the buttons, buckles, and weapons of both polished to an immaculate shine, and both wound as the tightest of coils. A ceremonial position, but a sacred one. Those weapons are loaded. And passing inspection, the first and second saluting as the second took on the watch, taking his place along the length of carpet that the soldiers stride back and forth with practiced and perfect steps, for the hours of their shift until the next changing of the guard, keeping up the ever-vigilant watch and final owed duty to every soldier resting in this sacred space. I feel a twinge of emotion thinking about it now, and moistness unbidden to my eyes as I write this, and as I narrate this, by the way. I think until the day I die, I will never forget that moment. So it was, even more drained than before. I walked back down the hill, back to the main road, back across the bridge as the sunset gave way to twilight, to that border of evening and night, and realized I probably should get a ride to my hotel since it was some 20 miles or so away. So I stayed on what seemed populated roads and managed to flag down a taxi and get to my hotel. My duffel sea bag still being on planes at the airport, I just had my backpack, and I've long traveled light, sometimes making entire trips with nothing but a backpack. So I got checked into my hotel, slept one of the deepest sleeps of my life. You can argue the merits of individual wars, when war is morally justified or not, what requirements are necessary for someone to be going to war for a good cause or having good intentions as a soldier, a sailor, a marine, an airman, or guardian. But not to put too fine a point on it, with no offense intended to our German, Japanese, or Soviet, former Soviet, Russian fellows here. I think the collective world is happy a few wars were fought to prevent such actors taking over more or all of the world. It'd be rare to find someone today willing to argue World War II should not have been fought and the belligerents be allowed to take all that they envisioned without resistance. And don't forget, war wars are what Veterans Day comes from. By all means, engage in philosophical and moral partisan parsings of wars through history, but the man or men in the arena have, from time to time, done right by our species collectively. And even if one argues not, conflict is intrinsic to life, dumb or otherwise. The important thing, then, is not to engage in needless conflict, and only to engage in conflict when necessary or force, but be always ready to engage in the conflicts one must, and honor those who stand in the breach. War is hell, but as in all life, there are things worth fighting for, and dying for. Memorial Day recognizes the fallen, Veterans Day the living. Society has few more sacred duties and trusts.